If anybody's just joining us online, welcome to tonight's program on the Civil War through the eyes of Emma Lyon Bryan. I am delighted to welcome back tonight's speaker. Dale Harder is a Rockingham County native and longtime member and contributor to Rocktown History, the Harrisonburg Rockingham Historical Society. Currently a librarian at Matoka High School in Chesterfield County, Dale previously has worked as an archivist, reference librarian, editor, historian, and museum director at numerous institutions, including HRHS, the Library of Virginia, and Bridgewater College.
Welcome to the program tonight. Happy to tell you all a little bit about a woman named Emma Lyon Bryan. I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm not going to read from a script. Every time I try to read a script, I get all messed up, and I feel like I'm too, what's the word, just too stodgy and too and I just don't, I think maybe I'm just going to try to tell you some stories about Emma Lyon Bryan and the world she imagined or the world she experienced in the Civil War. But first of all, and if you're not familiar, this is a picture of Emma Lyon Bryan. Would have been about 1870. It was taken by a Harrisonburg photographer named J.O.A. Clary. And this is her painting. If you haven't seen it before, here at the Rocktown History Center is the town of Harrisonburg, 1867. This is her painting of Harrisonburg. And this is her view of Harrisonburg in about 1867. I wanted to give you since it was post-Civil War, and we'll talk about that in a minute, I wanted to give you the only description I know of somebody really talking about Harrisonburg after the war, and to see if you all think well, you'll see it's different from Emma Lyon Bryan's vision, at least in 1867, and throughout her life, as we'll talk about. This is in a book called Two Paths to the New South by James Tice Moore. And there was a man named George William Bagby, and he was a humorist. He was a writer for newspapers, and he traveled through Virginia after the war, reporting on places he saw and writing about them. And he came to Harrisonburg in 1881. And here's what he had to say. Bagby's description of Harrisonburg's bustling atmosphere provided an indication of the spirit of the entire mountain country. He wrote, probably not 10 men in the place, he insisted, approved the war. Virginia traditions, the honor and the glory of the past, are as nothing in the light of solid comfort and prosperity. Fame is a good thing, a great thing, if you will, but as matters stand in this transitory vale, a plenty to eat, a big crop, and a growing bank account are better. So Bagby saw this as didn't care about the war, it was all about what are we doing now, what's happening now. So let me tell you a little bit about Emma Lyon Bryan. And I couldn't believe this is St. Patrick's Day because Bryan is an Irish name. It supposedly was changed from O'Brien, could have been Brian or O'Brien, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And I want to start out with a few sources of, Emma Lyon Bryan was a very romantic person. She had a romantic image of her life and things that influenced her writing, influenced her. I call her a jewel of all trades. She was a composer, she was an artist, she was a writer. Now you can debate how well she did all these things, and there are debates about that. And you can read her book that we'll talk about in a minute online. It's actually, you can download a free copy of it. But the amazing thing was she did all these things in her lifetime, and at the same time was a wife and a mother. Some of her influences, I'll just start at the top here. This is a book called The Mountain Muse, The Adventures of Daniel Boone, and it was written by a man named Daniel Bryan. And she was not related to Daniel Bryan by birth or by kin, but she was related to him by marriage. His brother was Alan Bryan, who was Pendleton Brian's father. Pendleton Brian was the husband of Emma Lyon Bryan. But this is an early 1813 poem. It's one of the first, it's kind of famous. It's not viewed as well as it was, but it's basically a tale of Daniel Boone. And it was published in Harrisonburg by Davison and Bourne in 1813. So Harrisonburg was publishing books at that time. And the interesting about this too is also a poem in this. And the poem is not about Daniel Boone, but the poem says that all the proceeds for this are going to the Ann Smith Academy in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And so we'll talk about this. So this is 1813. This picture here is a painting. This is the city of Richmond from Gamble Hill. And this painting is by a man named Edward Beyer, who was a German painter who came to Virginia in the 1850s and went up and down the valley and painted pictures of Stanton, Winchester, all the springs. He created an album of Virginia paintings that he did. And You'll notice, look at the similarity when we go back to Emma Bryan's painting, and you'll see a similarity. This is an advertisement in the Richmond paper for Miss Nottingham's boarding school. And that's where Emma Bryan went to. Her first schooling was in this school, a day school and boarding school in Richmond, Virginia. And as you can see here, they taught painting, they taught French, Italian, all kinds of things. She got a well-versed education. She was influenced by, so we'll talk about, let me tell you a little bit about her. So Emma Bryan, or Emma Lyon, was born in 1838 in Richmond. Her name, Lyon, is not the original family name. Her father's name was Poznański, Jacob Poznański, and he was from Poland. He was one of the first Polish immigrants to Richmond, and he decided to change his name to Lyon somewhere along the way and was known as Jacob Lyon. He was Jewish, one of the first Jewish settlers of Richmond, and he was served in the Richmond Light Infantry Blues, which is what this picture is of, which was a very prestigious militia unit in Richmond. They were called up for Gabriel's Rebellion, this slave rebellion in the early 1800s. They were called up for the War of 1812, and he served in this. And they never did see a lot of duty, and they really didn't see a lot of duty throughout most of their career, but they were very famous Richmond Light Infantry Blues, famous unit. I met a man years ago in the National Guard who was 95 years old who had served in the Richmond Light Infantry Blues. Of course, you probably know this gentleman here. This is Edgar Allan Poe, and Edgar Allan Poe would have been a figure in Richmond area during this time period. There are many myths and falsehoods, and even things I wrote earlier. My first article I wrote on Emma Bryan was back in 2007, I think, 2008. And there are things in there that I got wrong. And as I go through the things, like I was telling Penny today, I want to try to say yet. I don't know this yet, because you always find something new as we go along. And so some of these things were stories. Well, anyway, Jacob Lyon met a woman. Jacob Lyon was married twice. His first two wives died, and he married a woman named Eliza White in 1813. And Eliza White's father was a man named Thomas White. Well, Edgar Allan Poe's employer at the Southern Literary Messenger was Thomas Willis White, and he had a daughter named Eliza. So the story got up that Edgar Allan Poe's daughter, or Edgar Allan Poe, had a relationship with Eliza White before she married Jacob Lyon. But that would have never, the dates don't figure out. But there's probably a source of that I'll tell you about later as we get on with that. That will maybe explain why that happened. And the other odd story was one of the famous events, and this is called the first great natural disaster, or first great disaster in America, was the Richmond Theater fire of 1811. And the story was that all three of Jacob Lyon's wives were at the fire that night, and all three of them survived. And that doesn't make sense either, because one wife died in 1810 and the fire was in 1811. But Eliza White, the daughter, and Emma Lyon's mother, she probably was there. And that is believed to be true. And in fact, it was such a famous event that when Eliza White Lyon died in the 1890s, her obituaries would say, oh, and she survived the Richmond Theater fire. And she was in several obituaries in several newspapers in Virginia and outside of Virginia. And so she was known for that. So you have a Jewish and a Episcopalian probably woman, a Protestant woman. They married. He had 5 children before he met her. They had 8 together, so they had a total of 13 children. And Jacob Lyon died in 1850. And so Eliza White lived into the 1890s, working as a milliner and also with her husband's War of 1812 pensioner. That's another thing, a factoid as I call them. When she died, in her obituary it says she's the oldest living War of 1812 pensioner, receiving a pension. So she was receiving that pension. They had many sons and daughters. And so anyway, so Emma Bryan she would have grown up being influenced by stories of Edgar Allan Poe, influenced by stories of the Richmond Theater fire, influenced by the works possibly of Daniel Bryan. Don't know for sure yet, but remember I said there's some proceeds went to the Anne Smith Academy. So Emma Lyon, she grew up, she went to Miss Nottingham's boarding school. Well, Miss Nottingham and her daughters ran this boarding school and day school in Richmond. And in the 1850s, they were asked to go to the Anne Smith Academy in Lexington, Virginia, and head that up. And Emma said, I loved her so much that I begged my mother to send me there. So she sent her to the Anne Smith Academy, where she went to school there for a while too. And from there, she went to Hollins Institute, which is now Hollins University. And this is a lithograph, and this also has an interesting connection, because the person who did this lithograph was a man named Charles Shoemaker. And Charles Shoemaker taught art at Hollins. he was what was called, I think it was called the Dusseldorf, or the German name, Institute of Art, or it was a kind of art done. He and Edward Beyer were from the same school. They probably knew each other. They definitely he probably visited him when he was at Hollins when Beyer was up and down the valley, doing paintings of the valley. And then finally, this is, I don't know if this, some people say this is still above Raleigh Springs. This is Lover's Leap and a profile of George Washington. Some people say it's a profile of an Indian. This would have been an influence on her writing later when she came to Rockingham County. So all these different influences, I hope I won't confuse you too much. I'll try to make it come all together. So this is Emma Lyon on the left. This is a photograph taken by Brown Photography in 1860 in Harrisonburg. This is her husband, Pendleton Brian, taken in Richmond in 1863 by Charles Reese. Took a lot of pictures of Confederates during the time in Richmond, a lot of people during the Civil War era. So they eventually married. So how did they get together? Well, when we discovered the painting of the town of Harrisonburg in 1867, the story was Emma had come to Harrisonburg. She was working in the hospital here. Pendleton came in, wounded from battle. She nursed him back to health, and they fell in love. Not true. Great story, but not true. What happened was she graduated from Hollins Institute in the late 1850s. She went back to Richmond briefly, but interesting enough, while she was at Hollins, she went to school with 3 young ladies from Rockingham County, and they were the Gray sisters. And the Gray sisters' father was Colonel Algernon Gray, and Colonel Algernon Gray was a major political figure in Rockingham County before the Civil War, was a Unionist. During the Civil War, the outbreak of the Civil War, he freed his slaves. And so he was a very controversial figure in the war, but before the war, he was very well known. And so an ad appeared in the Richmond paper for a teacher at the Rockingham Female Institute, 1859, 1860. Emma apparently applied for the job and got the job and came and taught at the seminary. I'm assuming she used her Gray connections as an interest to that. While she was at the institute, that's when she would have met Pendleton Brian, and that would have been before the war, of course. So a little bit about Pendleton Brian. So she'd come here, she was here, and then she left when the war broke out. The first contact we know of them together, the first only written evidence we have is a September 1861 letter written from Emma to Pendleton, and she's writing from Oxford, North Carolina, where she was working at a school. So that automatically tells you they'd already met, and the letter says they knew each other. So the whole meeting at the hospital later on would not have worked out. So anyway, so Pendleton Brian, a little bit about him. He was from the Bryan family. For some of y'all don't know, the Bryans were some of the first settlers of Rockingham County. They lived along Linville Creek, adjacent to the Lincoln families. The Lincoln homestead is down there, all through there. Legend has it that they were related to the Daniel Boone. His wife was Rebecca Bryan, that this Bryan family was related to that Bryan. That's never been proved. I think it's kind of not true, but they were all from Pennsylvania, and this was a migratory route. So the Bryans were a major family here early on. And if you really think about it, I got a good friend, Tim Armitrout, and I went down to Linville Creek and got on the side of a hill a couple of years ago to look and see all that area, because that was kind of that was like a major origination place. I can't say, but I'm not saying it correctly, but a lot of people started out there, the Lincolns, the Bryans. So anyway, William Bryan was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was the grandfather of Pendleton Brian. Pendleton Brian's father was named Lyon Bryan, and Pendleton was born in 1844 in Harrisonburg. Lyon Bryan was a lawyer in Harrisonburg, well-known, well-landed. And I'll kind of show you, I think I can show you kind of where his house stood. His house kind of stood where Broad Street meets East Market in Harrisonburg. And he had a large land. They were slaveholders. They owned about one of the largest slaveholders in Rockingham County, and which wasn't saying a whole lot because there weren't many big ones here, but I think they owned 19 slaves at one time. So Pendleton Brian went to the Rockingham Male Institute. He would have met, I'm assuming, her about that time. But before that, he decided, he was not of age, but he decided to run off and go to Virginia Military Institute. And he lasted about a week, and he ran back home. And his father was very embarrassed. There's letters at VMI saying, "I'm so sorry my son came here and left, I'm so ashamed," whatever. But he just couldn't, he was too young. He couldn't hack the military regiment. So, but anyway, in 1859, a militia company was formed in Rockingham County called the Valley Guards. And the Valley Guards were called out to the John Brown execution. And Pendleton Brian was with them. He went to the execution of John Brown, the trial, and I think they went twice to the trial and then back for the execution. So he was a witness to that. And then when the war broke out, the Valley Guards became Company G of the 10th Virginia Infantry. And he served until the Battle of Manassas, and he was injured, or he was wounded slightly, and he resigned his commission and didn't serve until later on, until he was conscripted, actually drafted in 1863, and served in the 62nd Virginia Mounted Infantry, which was a mounted cavalry unit, and also in McNeil's Rangers, which was a partisan outfit. There's not a lot known about a lot of things what they did, and especially the men in them, what they did and did not do. There's a lot of fables that were created later about maybe what Pendleton Brian did or did not do, but we really don't know much about his record in there. But this is an important point to know that I think Emma and Pendleton, their families would have been probably considered middle class, middle upper class families. So their experience in the war was different than a lot of people. I just went to a lecture by Peter Carmichael, who's a historian at Gettysburg College, and he's doing a study of semi-illiterate Confederate soldiers. And he talks about how their letters home, they were illiterate for the most part. So he said they spoke their letters. And so they spoke it, and they tried to phonetically speak it and try to figure it out and write it out for their families. And what they talked about and the things they went through were much different than the things you would hear Pendleton Brian and Emma Lyon Bryan talking about. So they actually met, so they had met each other. He came to Richmond after he was wounded at Manassas. And so they were together a little bit back and forth. And in the fall of 1864, they were married in Richmond. And I believe this was September of 1864, and came back to Rockingham County right before Sheridan's burning of the county. I believe there's not really anybody knowing. There was no letters exchanged, but the dates work out for that. So, so that's about them so far. So this is Emma Lyon Bryan's painting, an up-close painting of it in Rockingham, or in Harrisonburg, which we have here at the Historical Society, painted in 1867. A little bit about the painting. When the painting came out, and you have to understand that the things I've learned as I've done research, back in the 1860s, you didn't have art museums to have a painting at. So if you created a painting, you either sold it for somebody's private residence, or it didn't go anywhere. You just had it in your house. So this painting was actually auctioned or raffled off to the highest bidder in Christmas of 1867, I believe it was. And a person bought it, and it stayed in different families throughout Harrisonburg until it was rediscovered in 2006. But the painting, when it came out, there were two newspaper reports about it. One was the Old Commonwealth, which was a newer newspaper. And they talked about how it was a beautiful rendition of Harrisonburg, and showed how it was after the war, before the war. And the Rockingham Register, the older paper, their editor was a man named John Workman and Samuel Yost. And they said, great painting. And they said it's an exact copy of Edward Byer's 1850s painting of Harrisonburg. Nobody's ever seen Edward Byer's 1850 painting of Harrisonburg. It doesn't exist. It was not. And now nobody knows what happened to it. But it's a copy from it. So she painted from that to create this in 1867. This would have been 1850s. She added buildings to it. I often wonder that if it wasn't a paint by number, if this is Edward Byer's painting, painted over by Emma, but they've had it tested and they say no. But she would have had to have his painting to do this, I believe, because it fits everything that Edward Byer did, all these details. So there's been some talk about what it does and what it does not do. Did it create a colorful representation of Harrisonburg after the war, after a war that destroyed everything? Or was it really realistic? And I say it is, because Harrisonburg was really not damaged during the Civil War. The county was burned outside, and Emma talks about this in her fictional novel about how the county was burned. But other than the bells being taken out of the church towers and melted down for cannonballs or whatever, there really was no damage to the town. So by 1867, it would have looked pretty nice. So the great thing about this painting, I don't think is the symbolism in it, but it's the fact that it gives you a representation of Harrisonburg is from before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and after the Civil War. A pretty good snapshot. You can learn a lot from it. And I'm not as knowledgeable as other people with this painting. Tell me if I'm wrong. Of course, this is Woodbine Cemetery here. This is Stoneleigh here. Of course, Massanutten and Peak. I believe this is that the courthouse, or is that a cupola on top of the church? You know, Penny? That's the fourth courthouse, right? And so, and this house, I believe here, would have been Pendleton Brian's house. It would have stood on Broad Street and gone along back through here, many, many acres of land. So that shows you the courthouse. And these were people talked about when soldiers came through Rockingham County, through Harrisonburg. They talked about going past the courthouse. They talked about Woodbine Cemetery. This is a detail of, this was the female seminary. This is now where the municipal building at Harrisonburg stands. This was the female seminary. During the war, this was used as a hospital, a Confederate hospital. This is where Emma Bryan did, in fact, do some nursing. And so she would have been there. This house, I believe this one is now the Quilt Museum. Yes? John T. Harrison. Yeah, okay. So this was the house of Tiff Warren. He was a colonel in the 10th Virginia Infantry. He was killed at the Battle of the Wilderness. It was a death that people all around Harrisonburg felt. He was very much of a martyr. One of the stories I heard years ago was the mother, his widow took their son to his corpse and pointed out the hole in his chest and said, "Always remember what the Yankees did to your father." So you remember those kind of things. And so anyway, so you got people out in the field working. You have sometimes your scale was not good. You've got a guy riding a horse here, but this would show you a place from Emma Lyon Bryan's life. And so it tells you a little bit about her life too. So that's where she would have been in that hospital working during the Civil War. We know quite a bit about that too through a lot of research by Dale McAllister. There were a lot of reports in the Rockingham Register showing when people would bring in food for the soldiers or bandages or whatever, or would volunteer there. And also take this point to say too, that when I say Emma Bryan was a nurse, she was not a nurse in the way we think of nurses today. And neither were most of the other nurses you hear about in the Civil War. They would come in and maybe hold a hand, bathe a brow, bring in flowers, talk to soldiers. But the men were, the male surgeons were the ones who were doing the operations. And a lot of the women were not equipped to do that. Some of them didn't do it very well. But most of the women, with a few exceptions, most of the women were more of caregivers, caretakers, trying to comfort men while they were in the hospital. So this was 1867. So this is Emma Lyon Bryan's version of Harrisonburg during the Civil War. This is a painting called Where Ashby Fell. This painting was done in 1896. And this is a painting, the first commemoration we know of where Turner Ashby was killed. After that, some people call it the Battle of Goods Farm, some people call it the Battle of Harrisonburg, but it was during Jackson's Valley campaign where the Confederate General Turner Ashby was killed. He was an early martyr. There's a lot of stories about his death. There's a book called Blood Image by a professor at Clemson University that talks about the image of Turner Ashby and how it was used throughout the Civil War. He was a very early martyr. So Emma Bryan created a painting that would have been a symbol. It's kind of a piece of what we call lost cause art. This is the tree where Turner Ashby supposedly was killed by this tree. And it's a stump at that point because people were coming and taking pieces of wood. People were starting to take pilgrimages there. And this painting was done in the 1890s, and in 1898, they started creating the Turner Ashby Society to create the monument. And so we know that things started happening in the 1890s. And so we knew about this painting. It's one of these things, the Harrisonburg painting was lost forever. It was lost in plain sight, hidden in plain sight. Where Ashby Fell was hidden in plain sight. I went searching for this. This was donated to the Museum of the Confederacy in 1894, very well documented in the papers. Charles T. O'Farrell, who had been a resident of Harrisonburg, had presented it on behalf of the Confederate Veterans Camp to the Museum of the Confederacy, with no doubt. Emma Bryan was there when they presented it. But I went looking for it in 2007. There was no record of it. And they said, we think maybe it was burned in a fire and it was gone. Years later, when the book Picturing Harrisonburg was done, we found it. It had been mislabeled. I had talked to the museum curators, people I knew for years. They said, we can't find it. And then they found out they had been mislabeled. It was there all the while. So they have it. You'll find it in the book Picturing Harrisonburg if you have that. And so this was Emma Bryan's rendition of Where Ashby Fell. I went to the Museum of the Confederacy to see this original painting, and I was talking to Robert Hancock, who's the curator there. And I said, what can you tell me about Emma Bryan as a painter? And he said, she was a ham-fisted painter. And so he said she was not very good. And in fact, somebody had mentioned in an email to me that they said that the Blue Ridge Mountains look like the crags of the Rockies out here. So, and you see a big difference between this and the Beyer painting as far as the detail goes, but she's got the symbolism of the Confederate battle flag and all that there. So this is very interesting. A lot of this research you'll find, if you want to purchase a copy of this article I wrote for the journal, the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era, it talks more about this. But I'd worked on this article for about 3 or 4 years, and was getting ready to go to press, was doing some last edits. And a friend of mine, my uncle and I had taken a trip to Cooperstown to the Baseball Hall of Fame a couple summers ago. And a friend of mine had some books he wanted to donate. And we stopped to get these books. And he had something called James Taylor's Sketchbook. James Taylor was a sketch artist who traveled with the Union Army, Sheridan's Army here, and did a lot of sketches in 1864, including sketches of Rockingham County. And I had seen pictures of Sheridan's officers meeting Dunkers, brethren, the court square, them coming through. But I'd never recalled, I just started flipping through, and I came across this sketch, James Taylor's version of Where Ashby Fell. And in his sketchbook, they talked about going there in October 64. So Ashby died in 62. In 1864, they went there, and he talked about this piece of some kind of paper attached to the tree. And you can see it's much different than the stump in 1874, 92, this would have been, or 1896, this would have been 1864. And I noticed this caption, and it said, this Turner Ashby, it says, let me see if I can read it. In the misty blue that fills the hollows of our mountain hill, a shattered tree remains alone to tell where gallant Turner Ashby fell. And underneath it, it says, Emma Lyon Bryan. And when I saw this, I couldn't believe it. It just blew my mind. So what this says about, whoa, I knew I was going to get tangled up. What this says about Emma Bryan was she was already thinking in 1862 or 1864 about what his death meant and what the memory of it. And she was already starting memorializing this. So you see some of this stuff, the memorialization of the Confederacy. She was already recognizing these things in 1864 and said, this is important. This needs to be remembered. And for years, this was a pilgrimage. I found an article in an Atlanta newspaper about somebody coming back here and taking a pilgrimage to the Ashby, where Ashby fell. Everybody wanted to go there and see that, Northerners and Southerners alike. So she was very important for capturing this image. So that's her painting. So like I said, we can talk about how good she was or not. This was the book she created. In 1892, she wrote this fictional book, and this is a copy owned by the Harrisonburg Rockingham Historical Society. The flags on the front were painted by Emma Bryan for their book, and this is what it says. This book is mine, Emma Bryan, corrected by the author, not for sale, and it was given many years ago to the Historical Society. And this is a copy of her 1860 to 65, A Romance of the Valley of Virginia. Now, some historians have said this is a great piece of lost cause writing, that it really talked about a lot, said a lot about the war and how we felt about the North and how we felt about secession and all that. And it does say those things, but for the most part, this book is a representation of a lot of female literature that came out in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s after the Civil War. Very flowery, very romantic, but not a lot of, it says more just about romance and literature. I had a friend of mine that looked at it, he said, this is just awful. And I said, well, it's kind of interesting to read. You can find you can download a copy of this book online. But what I would like to share with you as we talk about history and what is history and what constitutes history and what constitutes memory, I wanted to read a little bit about a passage from this book, or several passages actually. You get a flair for her writing. So this is when the war starts. Let me tell you, give me the backdrop of the war. The war, this book is basically about the romance of two people, a young lady named Mina Bernadette, and Mina Bernadette is Emma Lyon Bryan, and her beau, Rudolph Walston, who I believe to be Pendleton Brian. And if you read this book, it's set in Rockville, which is kind of a derivation of Rocktown. And I challenge everybody to go read this book. You start reading this book and he takes her out to Lover's Leap. He takes her out to Ribbon Rock. He takes her to places in Rockingham County. The first scene, she's either setting on Chestnut Ridge or she's in the Massanutten Mountains. And so it's a romance of these two people. And then then the war happens and she goes to Richmond. She has an aunt who lives in Richmond. She goes there for a while. She talks about things that really happened in the war in Norfolk, things that really happened in Richmond. But a lot of it is just made up to go around this romance. And there's more romance to it than there is anything else. So this is a kind of a piece of her writing. She says, the ominous cloud that for years had been lowering over the political sky had now gathered in one black mass to explode in the presidential election of 1860, electrifying the whole country with the momentous questions of state sovereignty and slavery. She says, these were not the days of public schools and women's rights. Southern women shrunk from publicity, and Mina had no male relative to defend her. And this is a glimpse of Rockingham County and Harrisonburg. Nothing was now talked of but the impending war. New military companies were forming, and even the women who stood as a unit by their states discussed the momentous situation. Union fathers were made miserable by secession wives and daughters huzzaing, while the old men groaned in the knowledge of the devastation and misery that would ensue from the conflict between the sections, and dubious of the result, sold their slaves to remain Union men in security that the Confederacy would not molest them. And in the event of defeat, they would have nothing to lose, being sure of recognition by the federal government. Rudolph Walston's father is a man named Colonel Walston, who I believe to be probably a combination of Colonel Gray, Algernon Gray, who she knew, who was a Unionist, and maybe a couple other people in Harrisonburg too, but she talks about, and there's a whole love thing that happened with their family too, and I'll just challenge you to try to read it and see what you think of it. But as we talked about what was real and what was not real about Pendleton's war record, She talked about the 10th Virginia, the Valley Guard. The 10th Virginia, which the Valley Guard was the color company, had been ordered in turn to Harper's Ferry, Winchester, Romney, and back to Winchester, from whence they reached the field of Manassas just in time to respond to General Joseph Johnston's wish for 4 more regiments. Thenceforth, Rudolph seemed lost. His regiment, she knew, had participated in the engagement, but his name was neither in the list of killed, wounded, or prisoners. After every battle, she visited the hospitals of the city and wrote to every point at which she knew the 10th was stationed without response. The danger and peril of the times was kindling anew in her heart the love that had been smothered under her momentary infatuation for a priest. And the priest is another old thing I just discovered in the last couple of days. His name was Father Bicchio. He was a Catholic priest that she has in the story. There was a Catholic priest in Stanton at the time, almost the same name. You Google Father Bicchio in Stanton, and you'll find all kinds of stories about this guy. But anyway, so here's what happened. So she talks about, thus leaving Mina to her duties and pleasures, dashed with the bitterness of remembrance and broken by the tirades and reproaches of Aunt Rachel, we follow Rudolph. Mina's letter announcing her removal did not reach him, and he had no time to communicate with her before being ordered double quick to the field of Manassas, where they were only halted when in sight of a glittering flanks of bayonets. Uncertain whether facing friend or foe, the color bearer was ordered to unfurl his flag. Rudolph, seeing him hesitate, seized the banner and mounting a fence, threw its folds to the breeze, bringing a shower of death-dealing bullets for response, and he knew no more until the dews of night aroused him to a consciousness of intense thirst, with the knowledge that he was wounded. He attempted to rise, and in a moment, kind hands were ministering to him. Men and women and children from miles around had flocked to the battlefield to care for the brave soldiers. And born to a private residence, his name, like many others, was missed in the report of the battle. A slight wound in the head and a more severe one in his shoulder kept him confined for many weeks. Pendleton Brian at the Battle of Manassas had a slight wound to the head. So she's using this as history. So what I started thinking, I've just been thinking about this in the last couple of days, there is history in this. You just got to figure out what is real and what is not. And maybe we never will figure that out. But that's in A Romance of the Valley. She also was a composer. She wrote this. We have this here. Y'all, our in-house guest can look at this tonight. We have her waltzing down the Valley of Virginia, which she did in 1901. And it was composed and dedicated to the daughters of the Southern Confederacy. This was actually, and the proceeds were sold to the sheet music for a Confederate memorial effort for soldiers, I think wounded soldiers in Baltimore. She also did a Chinese ballet comique, I don't know exactly, which was at the Mason Hall. She directed it, she was and wrote it, and she was also an actress in it. And this was also done for the Confederate Memorial Association. Now, as we talk about, the lost cause and why people did these things and why they were trying to memorialize the Confederacy, I found something very interesting. This was just last week too. Has anybody ever seen the magazine Garden and Gun? Well, there was an interview of somebody, an actor you may know named Ethan Hawke. And Ethan Hawke is doing a Showtime series and he's portraying John Brown, the abolitionist. And Ethan Hawke said something very interesting in this. He was in Richmond and they were working with Christy Coleman. Christy Coleman was the director of the American Civil War Museum. She's now at Jamestown, but she's African American. And Ethan Hawke writes, I'm a lover of history and prone to want our history to be respected, but it really is fascinating to see what and who we have chosen to honor. On the set of The Good Lord Bird, which is about John Brown, we wanted to get into the period mindset, so Christy Coleman, African American, who ran the American Civil War Museum, came and spoke to us. Someone asked her about the Confederate statues, Monument Avenue, and she had a fascinating answer. She said that after the Civil War, the South suffered a great and terrible loss, not just lives and money, but a loss of pride and self-esteem, and that these statues represent a society caught in the first stage of grief, which is denial. So here is a person of color saying, I understand. And so when you look at it, we sometimes we forget, especially in our current state, we forget that these people were dealing with loss of their livelihoods, of their relatives, and there was a lot of loss and grief that they had to deal with too, and it was real. So I think we always need to remember that. This is the reason I bring this up finally is this is Richmond during the war, and Emma Lyon's mother lived 2 blocks from the White House of the Confederacy. This is the White House of the Confederacy at 12th and Clay. Mrs. Lyon had a house, and was a boarding house at 10th and Clay. And this is Jefferson and Verona Davis after the war. And I'm sure you all have heard of the woman, Mary Chestnut. Mary Chestnut was the famous diarist of the Civil War. Her husband was a colonel. They were friends with the Davises. She kept the diary all through the Civil War and wrote. Her diary was not published till into the 20th century. But Emma Bryan had actually written, over here. She had written some reminiscences about the war in Richmond. She wrote about the famous bread riot of 1864. And she talked about her mother having a boarding house at 10th and Clay. And she said, a family from the different people who stayed there, she mentioned David Rump Jones, a Confederate general, General Hood would come there. She goes, there was a family living there, and a Colonel and Mrs. Chestnut, and they lived in our house, and all the people would come to see them, and they entertained people. Jefferson Davis would come down to visit. In fact, Jefferson Davis had a boil, a virulent boil of some type. We don't know where it was located on his body, but he came down to Emma's mother to have it lanced. And she lanced this bulletin. And she talked about how gracious the Davises were and how wonderful people they were. And so I got to thinking, I said, well, wow, if Emma was noting that Mary Chestnut was there, would Mary Chestnut have said anything about her? And so in Mary Chestnut's diary, I went and looked and I found an entry for the Lyons. And she talks about how we had to live in this boarding house owned by Mrs. Lyon, and how it wasn't the best place in the world. It was kind of shabby, but we needed to stay someplace. She was a South Carolinian. And so while living there, she remembered they had a young lady, and men innumerable scampered up the steps used by us in common, none of whom, however, were known to us. One day, this young person, in the course of a morning call, gave me her heart history briefly. I was engaged to such a nice young man, but he lost everything in that Yankee raid around Winchester. Que faire? Would you have me marry and starve? Never. They did not leave him enough to buy me shoestrings. Mama is perfectly miserable because I am now flirting with a Frenchman, and he not even of our faith. Then she started to say, by the way, this young lady was a Jewess. She is wasting her time fretting. A Confederate soldier with 95 Confederate dollars a month, that would not keep me in hairpins. The youngest daughter of the Lyons family was Emma Lyon. I do believe that Mary Chestnut was talking about Emma Lyon. In the book, Romance of the Valley, once you should go read it again. And in that book, she talks about being at a boarding house that her aunt, Rachel White, ran. And she made a point of saying, people thought I was a flirt. And this is Mina Bernadette speaking. People thought I was a flirt, but I wasn't a flirt. I don't know what they were talking about. And I'm thinking, all this is happening at the same time, but Mary Chestnut and Emma Bryan were not corresponding. So it's weird the way history comes together. So finally, the other way she documented the Civil War history was through her family. And she was a member of the United Daughters of Confederacy. And so she applied to, this is her application for the United Daughters of Confederacy. The original is at JMU. This is a medal also owned by the Historical Society. This is a cross of honor that were given to Confederate veterans. And to do this, Emma Bryan had to submit him. Pendleton Brian did not submit any paperwork. Pendleton Brian died in 1906. Her applications were after this. But she also wrote about what her different members of her family did. And she talked about what Pendleton Brian did. And she said he was just slightly wounded. He was with McNeil's Rangers. He was with the 62nd, but she didn't embellish his record. She talked about her nephew and her brother who fought with the Richmond Light Infantry Blues, which this is a photograph from the Library of Congress. These are two unidentified members of the Richmond Light Infantry Blues that were assigned to Company A, 46th Virginia Infantry. Emma's brother and her younger nephew were in Company A. Could it be them? It's unidentified. Doubt it, but I like to think so now. But in it, she talked about her brothers and nephews were from Richmond. Their military experience was much different. Most Richmond units stayed near home, like some of the Rockingham County units did, McNeil's Rangers, the 62nd Mounted Virginia. They didn't see a lot of action. One of them was captured very early in the war. One had a hernia, had to leave. One person supposedly rode with Quantrell in Kansas and fought against John Brown in Kansas before the war. And so, but none of their records were really anything we think they weren't dishonorable, but they didn't do a whole lot. And I think a lot of times this is the experience of the Civil War soldier. Many more died from disease than did in battle, and not everybody was this great hero, including Pendleton Brian, and he never tried to embellish his record. But this is one of the ways she went ahead and wrote her history of the war. So is that my last slide? I think I have one more, right? And I have one after that. Okay. So this is the Bryans post-Civil War. This is Emma. This was a descendant of hers. They gave us this photograph. This would have been post-Civil War. This is Pendleton Brian, 1876. After the war, Pendleton Brian became the mayor of Harrisonburg. He was the town recorder. He was a commissioner of accounts. Emma Bryan opened several schools. She did all the things I told you about. She wrote other stories. She raised 2 sons, one of whom was this young man here, Alan Cuthbert Tinky Bryan. We'll call him Tinky. A lot of the embellishment of what happened after Emma Bryan died, all of a sudden in her obituary, Pendleton Brian was a gallant hero who had fought at Harper's Ferry. He had been at Manassas. He had been here. He had helped capture Union generals. He'd done all these things. I believe all these stories were kind of made up by Alan Tinky Bryan. But now I think that he talks about how his grandfather, Alan Bryan, and Judge Gray, Algernon Gray, went to David Hunter, who David Hunter came before Sheridan and was going to burn Harrisonburg. He said, but my grandfather and Colonel Gray stopped him. Maybe there's some truth to that. Don't know yet. The stories are still out there. So Emma died in 1916. When she died, it was a front page news of the Daily News Record. First funeral ever held in Harrisonburg, when you had it was a Presbyterian minister and a Jewish rabbi did the ceremony together because she was acknowledging her Jewish and her Protestant roots. Pendleton Brian died in 1906, died of a massive heart attack. It was front page news. But everything they talked about Pendleton Brian was about how he was low key. He was very shy. He was unassuming. He did not try to puff up who he was. He knew who he was. And I always get the feeling that was a contrast from Emma. And in fact, in Emma's application for the UDC and for one of the Cross of Honors, she said, I tried to make him a hero or a judge, but alas. And so, but everybody back in that era would have told you Pendleton Brian was a fine man. But to her, she wanted something more, but she realized he wasn't. I don't think the Sun ever did. The Sun wrote many articles in the Harrisonburg paper until he died in the 1930s. I even found an article in the JMU Breeze where he had somebody interview and he was talking about he's told stories about Daniel Boone being here, and he told stories about the war, and he told all kinds of crazy stories that maybe there was truth, but maybe there was not. Don't know yet. So she died in 1916. That's the end of the story. And it's funny is I was doing this research for this article, and I had found everything, and I had done a lot of research, and I had a box full of stuff. And the other night I was going through and I was looking for some things, and I said, I found something I remember seeing, but I didn't have for the article. For a person like Emma Bryan, there's a reason why people don't know about people like this. I research obscure people, and it takes forever because obscure people don't leave a record usually. You really have to dig and dig and dig, and I've been digging for a long time. So one of the things I dug in years ago, the Confederate Veterans Camp, of which this is the banner for the SB Gibbons Camp. Their records were kept here. They're at JMU. They're microfilmed at the Library of Virginia. So I went through all this microfilm, every paper, trying to see if I could find any letters from Emma Bryan to anybody or any mention of Emma Bryan in the Gibbons Camp papers. And so I finally found this is an undated letter. It'll show you how much history does not change. This is a letter from Emma Bryan on behalf of the Daughters of the Confederacy. To the President Commander of the SB Gibbons Camp, gentlemen, we have been appointed by the Turner Ashby chapter of the Daughters of the Confederacy to solicit from the veterans, sons, and citizens subscriptions for a medal to be given to a pupil of the Rockingham schools for the best composition or essay on the Confederacy to be read publicly on Memorial Day. The woeful ignorance of the rising generation on this subject and the faulty teaching from present histories is our reason for this movement. We do not wish our brave heroes to be remembered by their posterity as traitors and rebels. And we hope each member of our beloved Simeon Beaufort Gibbons Camp will liberally assist in this movement and contribute, no matter how small or how large, will be greatly remembered by the daughters. Emma Bryan, Chairman. So isn't that interesting? Turn of the century, they were fighting about what the right history is not being told. It's being, and doesn't that sound familiar? Isn't it interesting how it goes to both sides? So I will stop there. I do want to share. How much time do we have, Penny? We okay? Oh, really? Okay. I want to share two things. First of all, as I talk about history and I talk about I'm talking about the weird ways that you find out about history. Now, I'm going to talk about a friend of mine's in the audience right now, and I'm going to share this story. I have a good friend of mine, Tim Armitage. We've grown up forever in the county, and we grew up together. And Tim grew up on a farm, and now in our adulthood, we get together probably about once a month, and we sit around the wood stove and have a little bourbon. And sometimes we go out in the fields and look for deer and things like that. And about a month ago, we were out setting out talking about stuff and having a little bourbon. And I asked him about his father. His father, Melvin Armitrout and Betty Armitrout, were antique dealers, antique collectors, and they were farmers. And a lot of Melvin Armitrout's tools are here at the, he donated them many years ago to the Historical Society. And so I'm talking to Tim, and I'd helped bale hay, and I'd been up on the farm, but I said, "What's your dad doing?" And Tim, we were talking, and Tim said, "You know, my dad had this knack for identifying cattle. I'm not get this completely right, but identifying cattle and good cattle. And he became a cattle broker, and people would come to him when they wanted to buy cattle, and he would buy cattle for him." I said, "Well, that's a really cool story. That's a really cool story." And so anyway, about a week or so, a couple weeks ago, I descended from my family, a Liskey family, another Rockingham County family, had gotten in touch with us about an heirloom they wanted to give. They didn't have any kids. And so I called this woman the other week and talked to her on the phone. And so we started talking about history and people we knew. And she had grown up here in Harrisonburg. Her name was Jackie Shiflett Hall. She now lives in Florida. Her parents were Jack and Frances Shiflett, and they lived here in Harrisonburg. And she grew up here, went to Harrisonburg High School. And so we're talking about stuff. And I said something about where you went to church. And I said, somehow I came up and I said, "Yeah, I was Tim Armitrout." And she said, "Tim Armitrout, was his parents Melvin and Betty Armitrout?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "Oh, I knew them. We went to church very well." And with no prompting, she said, "You can tell Tim that my dad, Jack Shiflett, said people admired Melvin Armitrout for his ability to pick good cattle on sight as they went through the auction. Apparently, he could spot a good one or a bad one from a mile away, and local farmers asked for his help in buying cattle. Melvin had what my dad referred to as an eye for cattle, and he was so unassuming, never came off as a big shot or a know-it-all. He was just really, really good at what he did. Of course, I was a city kid who didn't know squat about cows, except I can usually tell dairy cattle from beef cattle, but that's about it." So you never know where your history is going to come from, your connection. So I challenge anybody out there to start recording these stories of your family. And remember, because the things we do every day are the things that make history later. And so I mentioned, does anybody remember the name of the female character of Romance of the Valley? Remember her name? Mina Bernadette. I've done something too to preserve Mina Bernadette's memory forever. I have the only cat named Mina B. This is our cat, and she is named for Mina Bernadette, probably the only cat that will ever be named for Mina Bernadette, but this is Mina Bernadette. So there you go. I'm done.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. We're so appreciative that you chose to find time in your schedule to discover more local history. If you appreciated the program, I invite you to like, follow, and share the Rocktown History Facebook and Instagram accounts, where you will find additional history news and notes. Also, please keep an eye on the News and Events tab on rocktownhistory.org. It's not been posted yet, but next month, graduate student and museum assistant Tyler Brinkerhoff will present his research on the Rubish Kiefer Publishing House and the shape note music it promoted. This will not be a third Thursday talk, since Tyler will be presenting his thesis at JMU that evening. The presentation and accompanying gallery opening are planned for Thursday, April 28th. We have always been pleased to offer free Third Thursday talks, and we ask you to help us keep them free by joining or donating under the Connect tab on the website. And on that note, the Great Community Give is coming in April, and I hope that you will take note of the messaging that will be coming about that. It's a great fundraiser for local history and, of course, other local nonprofits. If you're interested in reading Dale's article printed in the Journal of the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era, copies are available online and in the Rocktown History Bookstore, even tonight. And at the bottom of the website, you can also sign up for our e-blast for occasional inbox reminders and stories. And lastly, thank you for joining the conversation. Stay curious and support your local history. Again, thank you and good night.